on behalf of the long COVID groups. Matt Hancock and Dominic Cummings have said they were advised in early 2020 about the possibility of longer-term sequelae of COVID-19 by both Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty. On the 17th of May 2020, you shared an article, we didn't go to it, about people reporting prolonged symptoms of COVID-19 in a WhatsApp group with them all. In short, did you also receive advice about long-term sequelae from Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty at that time?
Not as far as I can remember at that time. I do remember repeatedly asking for advice, and I think that I finally got a paper from memory in summer of 2021.
Yes, we'll come to that. You were never provided with scientific advice doubting the existence of long COVID. Yet you've said that you were only persuaded that long COVID existed in June 2021. You've referred to that.
I didn't say that. I was only given scientific advice on COVID in June 2021.
Yes, I'm asking you questions about when you were persuaded. You were only convinced by him, that's Chris Whitty, that long COVID was a serious problem when, from July 2020, you had been receiving letters from patient advocates and members of Parliament asking for formal recognition of long COVID. In September 2020, Mr. Hancock reminded you about long COVID. In October 2020, the NHSE announced a 5-point plan for long COVID. And on the 13th of October 2020, Sir Patrick Vallance advised you about considering long COVID at a cabinet meeting, and he said, in evidence here, that he described long COVID to you and you were sceptical about it.
When was this?
13th of October 2020, Sir Patrick Vallance was. So I've given you a sequence of from July to October. Why wasn't this overwhelming body of advice and correspondence in 2020 sufficient to persuade you that long COVID was a serious problem at that time?
I don't want you to think, so first of all, I don't want anybody to think that I didn't think that it could be a serious problem. What I wanted to know was the evidence. I wanted to understand what exactly the sequelae consisted in, and how I should explain it to people, what the symptoms exactly were, and what kind of a syndrome it really was. And I was having some difficulty getting a clear picture, and that was the reality.
So this is a question, it appears, in relation to formal advice, written advice. But the box grid of October 2020, and we didn't go to it, 251910, that you scored bollocks on, was referring to the first NIHR report into long COVID, a research paper that had already been published on long COVID by that time. It laid out symptomatology on long COVID. If you wanted advice, why didn't you simply ask for that report to be provided to you?
I did ask for the evidence, and I did ask for reports to be provided, and eventually one was provided. I think that I think there's a slight conceptual. First of all, I wish to again to recognise the hurt that those words must have caused to people suffering from long COVID, and the very real suffering that they endure. And but when I referred to Gulf War syndrome, I was making I think a reasonable question, and I'm sure you wouldn't say that everybody suffering from Gulf War syndrome is mistaken.
Mr. Johnson, I don't want to be developed about Gulf War syndrome. I just want to ask you, do you agree you never asked for the NIHR report to be provided to you?
I certainly asked for a report to be provided for me into long COVID, and it was eventually provided, but much later on.
Yes, so not that report. Do you agree?
Yes.
Thank you. In July 2021, the Cabinet Office planned a policy which accepted high prevalence of COVID-19. It noted that the strategy was to continue to live with COVID without restrictions. One risk was noted as high rates of long COVID. The autumn-winter plan of 2021-22, published in September 2021, emphasised building defences through pharmaceutical interventions, and for long COVID only acknowledged the need for treatment. There was no effective treatment for long COVID, as there were no pharmaceutical interventions to prevent its development, and you agree the best way to prevent long COVID is to prevent infection of COVID-19. Did the government choose to adopt a policy which you knew would result in a significant number of people, including young people, suffering from long COVID?
What we did was to try to fight COVID, to try to fight infection and mortality in people of all ages by stopping the spread of the disease. And I thought that by fighting COVID, a fortiori, you could fight long COVID.
Yes, but you understand that in relation to the decisions in relation to COVID and long COVID, they have different symptomatology.
And that was precisely what I wanted to understand, and that was why I requested the report and the advice that I did. And when I spoke about Gulf War syndrome, what I meant literally was, can somebody explain to me, because Gulf War syndrome, as I'm sure you know, nobody would say, I'm sure you wouldn't, that everybody suffering from Gulf War syndrome is mistaken.
Yes, Mr. Johnson, I want to move away from Gulf War syndrome with greatest respect. A choice was taken to allow high rates of transmission, which brought more cases of long COVID, and you've said a number of times that messaging was incredibly important. Messaging, in the end, was the most important tool we had to deal with the virus. Why didn't you therefore communicate the risk of long COVID to the public so they could take measures to protect themselves?
Well, the way to protect yourself against long COVID is to avoid getting COVID.
That's not the simple. It doesn't follow, does it? They're not. There are other specific features of long COVID.
Unless I'm much mistaken, I don't believe there's a way of contracting long COVID without getting COVID.
But it has a different risk profile. Do you appreciate that?
Well, forgive me, and I don't wish in any way to, to minimise the importance of what you're saying, but I thought that the best way to fight the possibility of people having long-term sequelae from COVID was to stop them getting COVID in the first place.
Yes. Do you accept there's an indiscriminate risk to all people, children and the young, which is a different risk profile specific to long COVID?
Well, that was one of the things I was very interested to understand. I think that may very well be the case, but it is still also true, logically, that the best way to stop those individuals contracting COVID is to stop the spread of the disease, full stop.
Yeah. So can I take from that people do need to know about long COVID specifically? They can suffer from prolonged symptoms of COVID-19, and that nothing specifically was done about the risk of long COVID. Do you accept that?
Well, I don't accept that nothing was done about the risk of long COVID, because the government did everything that we could to stop the spread of COVID.
Yes. Last question. Last topic. Yesterday, you said in your view, some people thought they may be suffering from long COVID, but there was in fact another cause. The NIHR report, summarised in the October 2020 box return, addressed those very concerns that, in quotes, the lack of recognition of the pattern of symptoms by the public and by healthcare services meant people frequently felt their experiences were not believed, and this left many of feeling isolated and alone in coping with their disease.
And that's the same with Gulf War syndrome, by the way.
Yes, I haven't asked the question yet. It concluded, did the report, that more recognition and more support was needed. Having come to accept, as you have now, that long COVID is a debilitating and disabling illness, causing almost 2 million adults and children to suffer, do you now recognise that your prolonged disbelief in long COVID contributed to the delay in recognising long COVID, led to unwell people not being believed, and has meant decisions were taken on releasing NPIs without consideration of long COVID?
No, I don't think that. I think that if you look at what actually happened from a very early stage, we start investing in research into long COVID, and I think 50 million followed by another 75 million, and into trying to establish the exact pathology of the illness.
But the decisions were taken on releasing NPIs without consideration of long COVID. Do you accept that?
No, I think that there were going to be risks involved in releasing the MPIs. They were going to be basically the risk that the disease would spread, and that was the thing we wanted to fight.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Metzer.
Can I just complete the question, please, my lady? It's the last question, I promise you. Do you accept that widespread transmission of the disease without public communications on the risk of long COVID and without other mitigation measures meant people could not take steps to protect themselves from long COVID? Do you accept that?
No, I think that people were given plenty of advice to protect themselves from COVID, and as soon as we began to understand what long COVID was and its risks, we also publicised the risks of long COVID as well.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Metzer. Mr. Menon, you've moved. Trying to confuse me.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Mr. Johnson. I ask questions on behalf of a number of children's rights organisations. Can I start by seeing if we can agree on two matters, which I hope are uncontroversial? Firstly, in March 2020, when schools were closed for most children, you believed that schools should only close as a last resort if necessary to save lives and protect the NHS. Is that right?